Okay, let me plug back in the camera.
Okay.
This damn Apple computer, they got rid of USBs, and now there's just two plugs, and the charger is one of them.
No,
So
dude.
that's bullshit. Let me just put back
I
in
still have an iPhone,
settings here.
but I'm on that PC. I'm on that Windows 11 now, and it's pretty sweet.
I hear good. Fuck. Hold on, I'm gonna close Discord just really fast. Sometimes when you unplug and plug in, it doesn't register it.
No worries. Yeah, sure.
Let's see here. Goddamn settings. Yeah, how do you like? I mean, I've always actually been a Windows computer fan. It was just like during college,
Well,
um,
yeah, same. I had a MacBook Air in college, and it was fine for college. I mean, of course, you just I mean, it's not like you need much for college. You just need something to have Word documents and PowerPoint, right? Like and internet. But after college, I mean, I'm big into gaming. So after college, once I got my job, I saved up and I bought I customized and built a PC that has I
mm,
can interchange the into parts. I can open up the case and interchange parts and graphics cards and stuff. And I built a PC and I have a dual monitor setup, so I have two monitors. I invested in a nice like station because I like gaming and even like in music production too. So
no, absolutely. I totally get that. Yeah, like for gaming Macs or shit, like
yeah.
um, I actually like Logic for music. Like Logic is a better version of GarageBand. It works okay, but I still hear better things about most Windows stuff. So it's like I don't know, man. It's like I think I unfortunately drank the Apple Kool-Aid. Basically, like
Well, I mean,
it's just like
there was a time when Apple did have like the best like production stuff software for
mhm,
filmmaking because it was the ease of use and the professionalism of the softwares that they had was great, but everyone else caught up. So yeah, at one point, Logic was the easiest to use and the most professional in one for music
mhm,
production. But since then, FL Studio has caught up because FL Studio was always as advanced, but just hard to use. But now they've
mhm,
updated it for years to make it way more easier to use. So the advantages Mac had, I think, are gone. And Mac
mhm.
is not as like clean from viruses. Like hackers know how to hack Macs better now. So PC and Mac are both vulnerable from like data breaches and stuff. So I don't know, whatever. But it's still, I mean, it's still just preference, right? If you like a Mac, no big fucking deal.
Now, like a computer, I don't really give a shit to be honest. But like a tablet, for example, iPad all the way.
Oh yeah,
Like
yeah,
that's like I think Apple in terms of phones and tablets has like superseded everyone else in my opinion.
yeah.
Computers, there's a conversation to be had. Like yeah,
I'm not the buy an iPhone every year kind of guy, but I still have an
no.
iPhone and like iPhones are easy to use and they work and they don't bend anymore. Like they're fine.
Mhm. Well,
All right, let's get
so
into it.
what should we start with? All these we got a couple less sad topics and then a very unfortunate topic. So do we start happy or sad? I guess.
Well, they're kind of all. Let's start with
I mean, yeah.
eminent domain.
Okay, sounds good. Yeah, let's start off with not the really sad one. I guess it's probably
Um,
good.
well, it kind of goes into a little bit goes into it, kind of related in a
Yeah,
little
no, it
bit of a
definitely
way,
does.
but
Yeah.
let's start it off. So I'm gonna start recording. Let me speak for me real quick.
Hey, what up? Hello, everyone. Welcome
Okay.
back to the Tonic. Okay.
Okay, cool. All right, recording in three, two, one. Hello, welcome back to the Tonic Accord podcast. I'm your host, Drew, joined by my friend and also the host, Alex, here. We're going to be talking today about eminent domain and what that means in a political sense, why it's one of the most controversial rights that a government has, and the defenders of eminent domain and the opponents. And let's start getting to some examples as well. So, to start out, I want to define eminent domain, and what that is the government's right to take private property for public use with just compensation. And what that means is taking of a property is literal the seizure of the land or the things on the land, and removing all the economic benefit from a person, um, and going to the government. So this is not just zoning laws that say you can't have a fence 30 feet by water. That would not be eminent domain. Eminent domain would be you can't have any property by this waterfront, and the government will seize your land that you have there currently. Um, and so, but they can only do that for public use, and public use there's been a lot of litigation over what that means. It can sometimes include economic development can be considered public use. So in this the Supreme Court, there's a court case of Kelo versus the City of New London, which is in the United States, not England, but Kelo versus the City of New London. They determined that the government seizing private property there and then giving over that land for private companies to make a commercial district was under the guise of economic development for eminent domain. But then some people have argued against that, and the federal government went on to clarify. But the idea is you're taking something for public use. A great example is the interstate freeways, right? A freeway is not owned by a private company, it's for public use. And then it has to be with just compensation, which is the fair market value of the property taken. And at first, it did not include removal and relocation costs. However, some states and the federal government have added caveats to relocation assistance for that as well, but it varies. Um, and so, like I mentioned before, popular examples of this are eminent domain was used to get land to finish the interstate highway system in the United States. They figured it was worth removing the private property of some individuals for the public use of freeways to, for the infrastructure of the greater good. And there's philosophical arguments for and against. So let's get into some of that. Alex, what do you think of eminent domain, and what are some of the philosophical arguments that rattle around your head when you think of this topic?
Yeah, great question, man, and great summary of what it is. First off, I just want to bring up the Constitution for a second because I think that'll be important to mention later. The Fifth Amendment of the Constitution, says that Congress nor any government agency shall take private property for public use without just compensation. This is kind of a recognition, of pre-existing power to take private property for public use, blah, blah, blah. And in the early years, the Fifth Amendment kind of pertained to D.C., and so in broader sense, the federal government. But it was that Cole versus United States case in 1876, which actually kind of used language from the 14th Amendment, which said the power of eminent domain of state governments was unrestrained by any federal authority. So to summarize is that this was something that was in the Constitution in the Fifth Amendment saying you can't just take someone's land without paying for them. And a lot of people thought that was more just federal government, and states actually at times have tried to use that as well, using the 14th Amendment as the language for it. And just also I would just add before I go into how I feel about it is that I feel like there's it's the tale of two eminent domain cases here. Is that I feel like in the early days it was mainly just for what they called, condemning dangerous places to help the public good, right? Old beat down public buildings they would demolish and provide cities with drinking water. There's an example in New York of putting in aqueducts in old buildings, demolishing these old private buildings and putting in aqueducts for the health of the city. It was mainly just looking at public parks, public water, and transportation, and this was kind of just condemnation, or and so that was kind of the beginning. But then it went into land acquisition in the 20th century, and that's where it kind of gets a little more blurry because there's good examples of it, there's one, the Big Cypress National Preserve in Florida, where they saved a bunch of land that could have been used for private use and could have eroded the environmental beauty of that region, but instead, or the Redwood National Forest in California is another one. They used eminent domain to secure that and preserve that. But then that also gets into, so many other topics. I would just say off the bat that generally I understand it. I understand that especially as a growing country, sometimes you need to expand public programs, transportation, parks, public safety, things like fresh water. And sometimes that does mean you're going to interfere with a private business, a private property, a private piece of land. And sometimes there needs to be a way to deal with that. And I understand that sometimes for the national good, private goods need to be thrown out the door. That being said, I find that the problem is compensation. And you kind of mentioned it a little bit there, is that it doesn't always make up for some of the, like, outside costs. And also my worry is that, like, the highway interstate ones, I think a really good way to start with this is that in the 50s, like, I love Eisenhower. I think he's one of the best Republicans in a long time, and the interstate system in a lot of ways was necessary. A very big country like ours needs an interstate system. That being said, the problem is that they used eminent domain to go through a lot of these city centers. And the problem is that, like, I've been to Europe a lot. I spent a lot of time in Europe. There's beautiful city centers there, just that go back 500, 600 years. They're just so pretty. And there were city centers in a lot of the Midwest and the South in the United States that were gorgeous. Not as old as in Europe, but a lot of them were demolished to make way for these freeways. And the thing is okay, so if you compensate based on the money value, yeah, okay, I guess on paper that makes sense. But the problem is, what about the history? What about the culture? What about the fact that people have to move out of there? What about the cost of building something new? And if you just pay someone and compensate them at the time, it doesn't look into inflation, for example. And so there's a lot of issues that I have about where is the line between preserving historical monuments, historical buildings, and just culture, and also putting a nation forward with progress. And that's my issue, is that I feel like eminent domain, sometimes people aren't compensated justly, and sometimes it just creates land grabs that maybe are questionable.
Yeah, this is one of those issues where you have a lot. It is not very clear cut partisan, right?
Right.
I've heard people on the left argue against eminent domain, exactly what you're talking about in the highway things, because they argue that it was determined to go through city centers, which were predominantly more minorities, and that the government used eminent domain and purposely avoided using eminent domain in white neighborhoods and would enact eminent domain in more poverty-stricken black neighborhoods, so that it was, even though on paper this is a government right to use, they see it as, well, this is basically systemic racism being enacted through government choosing who to bulldoze. Um, a good example of where there's a lot of controversy for where I'm from in Los Angeles, is the Chavez Ravine, which is a Latino town, a small town of predominantly Mexicans, that used to be where Dodger Stadium currently is. And the why it's also particularly controversial is that the original use for eminent domain against that town, which was only, I think, a few hundred families, not a huge town, but a small one just outside of LA. And they said that they were bulldozing their land to make way for public housing projects, and that they would be compensated not only for their land, but be offered a like a spot in the new public housing projects. Well, the Chavez Ravine public housing projects were canceled shortly after people were evicted. There was even a famous photos, I think, from 1952, when they did the final evictions of the last 20 families who were refused to go, were not taking any compensation, and they were dragged out of their homes by police officers in Los Angeles, and it sparked a lot of controversy. Well, the public use for these housing projects didn't even get completed, and then the land was then sold to a private developer to be used for Dodger Stadium. And so in that case, they weren't even promised what they were promised, which was, well, we're going to use this for a certain housing project, and you'll get a spot in that. No one got that. And so again, your example of, there are oftentimes that idea of just compensation is not there. Uh, um, could create a lot of controversy. And so, while yes, we all enjoy the Dodgers here in like LA. In fact, LA is a very baseball town. The Dodgers are like part of the city's culture. Dodger Stadium is like considered one of the things you got to do if you're in LA for more than a week. Is just go to a Dodger game, get a Dodger dog. And so is a lot of added value from Dodger Stadium. Absolutely, thousands of jobs over the years, thousands. So that balance is hard to it's hard to look at that balance, but it's certainly, I know that example, the Chavez Ravine example for Dodger Stadium, is used on the left as an example of against eminent domain. I also know that there's plenty of right wing, especially more libertarian types, that are against the notion of eminent domain in general. Even for public use with just compensation, they still think that the government has no right to take, and that's where that's why this is one of the most heavily litigated ideas and issues around the government, is because it goes against the American idea of home ownership and private property. But at the same time, it has allowed us to and is almost required for the public infrastructure that has given us the advanced society we live in. The highway systems and stadiums are massive increases on our economic activity that we all see a benefit from. And so it's a tough one, but I do think eminent domain has to exist, and especially as we go for looking forward towards issues of climate change and private property usage that has outside effects like pollution and things. I think eminent domain is going to come into play more so with climate regulation. Oh, hold on. You are muted.
Oh, sorry.
Hey.
I do that sometimes in case I sneeze.
No worries,
My
you're good.
allergies are still bad up here with all that pine pollen. But anyways, yeah, like you brought up some really interesting points there. First off, yeah, like I was just reading through abuses of eminent domain on the Justice Department's website, and there are a lot, and I think that's the problem is like how prickly the U.S. system is with like kind of conjoining private with public. And so a lot of times, like even though it's for public use, sometimes you're going to have private contractors and developers in the process,
Right.
and then you get personal reasons. And that to me sounds like what happened at Dodger Stadium. Also, like side note, you're going to hate me because I actually, we went to Chapman down there for 4 years. I never went to Dodger Stadium. So, yeah, that's a problem. I kind of feel guilty when you mentioned that. But anyways, I just want to turn this kind of to more of a hypothetical for a second, just because it's the main reason why I guess you could put me more as a cultural libertarian on this issue. And it's basically there's a guy named Hernando de Soto who is a Peruvian economist who won, I believe it was the Pulitzer Prize and a Nobel Prize in his book The Mystery of Capital, which came out in 2000. And it's one of my favorite books I've read recently. And it talks about how in the U.S. there is contract law. There is ownership, so people know whose property is whose. But his argument is that capitalism hasn't worked in a lot of the developing world because there just isn't written contracts. He's definitely pro-capitalism, but he believes that business law and business rights just don't exist because of the informal economy in a lot of the world. And so my issue is that we've seen abuses of eminent domain involving property rights throughout the world. Not eminent domain specifically, because I think that's more of a U.S. term and more of a UK, Old English term for that. But there is an interesting example that I always just kind of point to is in South Africa and Zimbabwe specifically. There was that obviously apartheid rule in South Africa specifically, and in Zimbabwe there was a lot of white land ownership. And after the fall of apartheid and more ethnic and local groups started running, a lot of South Africa, there was kind of this idea of reparations through grasping large amounts of land from white owners.
Right.
And it really created kind of a bitter rivalry between poor white people and poor African tribes that had been there their whole lives. And it's like, yeah, a lot of these people were Afrikaners, they had descendants from either the Netherlands or from South Africa, but these were also poor people who might not have been directly involved in this. And Robert Mugabe, who was the ex-leader of Zimbabwe, he was known for sending mobs and squads out to seize land from white people. And of course, this actually is what Fox News has used as white replacement theory a lot of the time. They always use this as an example, so I don't really want to go too far down the weeds with that. But that is a conversation to be had, is when land is seized for political reasons or for trying to, commit to solving past atrocities. But then again, just while I'm on that point, I will say that in the United States, because we have such a good, not good, but it's better than a lot of the world in terms of property ownership and legal codes behind it. There is the Hawaii Land Reform Act of 1967, which actually is a good example of land grabs. And this is basically like 72 private landowners possessed pretty much 50% of the land on the Big Island, I believe it was. I don't actually have that, but I think it was the Big Island. And basically they wanted to take some of this land away from from this like 70 people who own 50% of the land, because indigenous and local people had nothing. And the Supreme Court actually agreed that this was constitutional because it wasn't for public use, but it was better for the public good. And I think like the U.S. can have those complicated conversations about what is better for the public good. The Supreme Court actually seemed to kind of come down favorably on some of these cases, but I just worry like the general idea of partisan land grabbing, especially in a very divided country.
Yeah, there's a lot of interesting historical examples of eminent domain, not just in the U.S. as well. There's also the 1880s had the Irish Land War, which was the same
Mm,
thing, which was in Northern Ireland. They found that way too much, well, or the government. I mean, actually, the British government in Northern Ireland had said, okay, there's actually a problem. The way too much of the land is owned by Protestant Northern Irish, like Protestants that have British origins, and the Catholic Irish in Northern Ireland had very little in land ownership, and they were revolting and fighting. And there's also, this is post potato famine as well, so this is, 1880s. It was not looking good for anybody, and so because of the fighting, it eventually, it even got to the point where people were like, there was land grabs at first by the Protestants for the Catholics, and the Catholics were literally fighting off soldiers with their pickets, and then they reversed it and were giving back land. But there was plenty of examples of the government seizing and moving land from different private hands in Ireland to try and quell rebellions and to try and recalculate the land ownership percentage in Northern Ireland. Um, so yeah, it's one of those things where it's like it's like any other, like there's plenty of instances in government where we have to allow some things that make us a little uncomfortable with governments. Like, we all accept we are giving the government a monopoly on the use of force. We are giving the government, in most cases, right, as a general in sense, we're letting the government have the ability to kill, right? For any state that has a death penalty, that's a thing. Um, so and it's not like I would want someone else to have that power. So there are things that I think are in that realm of, we have to allow governments to have some kind of powers that maybe make us feel uncomfortable, but are required for an order in society. So the monopoly on force is one, right? Police forces, the law enforcement has to have more of a say in enforcing laws than random gangs or vigilantes. And in this one is, and when push comes to shove, I think the government does have a right in some instances, but that is why I think we need to have a robust regulated system that can, I guess, protect the individuals from when eminent domain does go too far. But like I said earlier, I think, the issues of, as the issues over freeways become less of a thing. Well, I mean, I don't know. Maybe that's more and more. And I don't know. In my city, they're constantly building freeways, and there seems to be not
mhm.
enough. But I see things like, you know, like beachfront property. Like, that's a limited resource, and eventually, with the population increases, at some point there will actually be not enough beachfront property. Now, maybe Alaska, who no one there'd be so much in Alaska that's like not worth it. But like beachfront property in California, if everyone had a private property on the beach, and there was none of it was there for public use, at some point I would be like, no, you should use eminent domain. I think people have a right to go to the beach in California. Eminent domain should be there, that the government should seize at least some part of the beach back, that people get there. Now, there is restrictions on beachfront properties because of that reason. So there is absolutely a use for eminent domain in modern society. But yes, I agree with you though, Alex, that we have to be very, very careful of when and how it's used.
No, absolutely, and I think we can definitely agree on that. And an interesting example. I was talking to one of my coworkers today, and we were kind of talking about homelessness. And
Mm,
that was one that kind of triggered my mind, especially in California. And I'm not really
yes.
trying to put out any solutions with this one, but it is an interesting one because, we were talking about the highways. I think it was the 1956 Highway Act that Eisenhower put out. And, that looked, well, fun fact, it was like a lot of GM tech and executives were involved in this plan because they wanted cars more used. Really surprising in the U.S. that private industries would be influencing this, but basically they use the term blight a lot, right? Which, especially in the 50s, given kind of the racially driven time, a lot of the blight meant inner cities, like you said,
Yes.
and But now blight could also mean the fact that there's a serious homeless problem in a lot of the West Coast, and I could understand that if you're, a working person with a apartment or a house and a job, it's ruining your quality of life to have that amount of homelessness so close to where you live. Especially if you're, a homeowner or a landowner, like it's going to ruin your property values. And like that would be an interesting one is like using that term blight again to talk about the homeless problem in this, like specifically California, Seattle, and Portland, where I think is kind of the main places. Just the weather's better in California, so people are there. But like that's a thing I always wonder is like they use the term urban renewal to unfortunately destroy these inner cities, during the highway days. But like I wonder, like Drew, do you think that eminent domain would like say they basically had portions of like what's that park in LA where there's big homeless camps? I
Well,
always forget.
this just happened. This is exactly what just happened. So Echo Park. So Echo Park was
Uh-huh.
basically, like you say. I mean, you could say, but it's the legal term of blighted. There was shanty towns all over the park. Reports of violence at night, right? Like assaults, people finding needles, right? Like, but like really bad. And Echo Park is supposed to be like the golden jewel of parks in LA. It's it has a big pond. There's fountains. You can see downtown. You're up kind of on this hill. It's a huge park. And that was one of the things that just happened recently was there was protests on both sides, for and against the action, where the city decided that because for a while they didn't do anything about these massive shanty towns. And I'm talking like tents, like hundreds and hundreds of tents. And they did eventually decide that okay, this has to go, and so they evacuated. I mean, they literally forcibly removed thousands of homeless people from Echo Park, and basically with that idea of that this is blighted, and that's the and I when I first heard that term, I cringed a little bit because I do feel like, oh man, like I mean, we are talking about people's livelihoods, we're talking about people's homeless person, their entire possessions was maybe in that tent in that park. However, the other side of that coin is very valid, which is this is a park. This allotment is there for the entire public of Los Angeles to enjoy as
Mhm.
a public park to like bring kids and run around and bring my dog and fish and whatever. And it's not being used for that purpose now. It's now being used by a private individual to do heroin in the bathroom and to or a private individual that's not doing heroin but still is impoverished and has to use facilities and put up their tent on a walkway, right? That could be blocking disabled people. Like there's a countless other things that are happening on this park that are not for the original intended use, and that not only are not for the intended use, but prevent the overall public from the original use. I can't walk my dog safely if I feel I'm going to get assaulted at the park or step on a needle that can infect me, right? Or I have to go around a tent city. So that conversation was had in Los Angeles, and eventually, a push came to shove, the police cleared it. And frankly, this might offend some of my more liberal friends, but I agree with the action. I personally feel that that park should be used for park purposes. And so, while the homeless problem is a huge problem, we need to have more housing. The solution is to not let people build a slum in Echo Park.
And I mean, I would just add to that. I think that's a really good point, and I full heartedly agree with that. Is that um, like this sounds a little bit cold, but I feel like the idea of a public good or the public use or the public betterment involves like helping the general community who are paying into the system. And to be completely honest, like a lot of these parks specifically that have kind of been overrun just with homeless and looters, or not looters and squatters, excuse me, is that there's a compensation question there. Is like this is obviously a public park already. So is their personal property what is then considered the compensation? Like that does confuse me a little bit,
Sure.
Um and but the thing is, this reminds me of the early days when they used eminent domain under the wording of the original Fifth Amendment, which was kind of like to facilitate public health and public use. And like if parks are getting dirty and dangerous and no one wants to go there, then I think that's part of the public good to make them safer. again, I don't know how you compensate people that are just living there or squatting there without paying to be there. Now that's a whole other conversation. But I think that like right now the homeless problems in especially the West Coast are an interesting example of like a more convoluted issue with that.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, while it might, like you said, it's like already on a public park, so it might not be the same like constitutional arguments around eminent domain as like on a federal case. I still think it's still the idea of government forcibly removing people for the greater
Mm-hmm.
good, right? Or forcibly doing something against a private individual for the greater good, and
Mm,
and while it is a case by case basis and there are lines that can't be crossed, generally think that this power of the government has to be maintained and I think will only have to be used more in the future, as populations increase and as the nuances of land use, because land use isn't just do I get to fish on the creek or not. Now it really is there oil below? What are the implications? Well, if you do something with your cows at this part of the creek, it affects people 100 miles down the creek. So land use, like I've advocated for the readjusting our understanding of land use and land ownership in general anyway, just on a grand scale. But to include part of that, I think has to be the the understanding that eminent domain is a power that the government will and has to use, but with that in mind, we make sure that it's not used unjustly. And I think we're both in agreement that I think we could probably do more to define just compensation more. I think that especially at the state level, that difference between the states and federal level, I think some states or don't do anything for like reallocation assistance, and so should definitely do more.
absolutely. And just the last thing I'll add, I know we're going over on this one, but it's like I feel like it or not, this is probably not gonna be a popular thing to say, but it's like California has a surplus right now, and it's mainly because of capital gains taxes on a lot of wealthy people. Like California does really well with tax revenue because of wealthy people, and if we're seeing more Californians leave than come over the last year, and I just heard it. This is all anecdotal, but there's a lot of like public figures and that have made it very vocal that they're leaving because of the homeless problem. Like over time, those taxes that they are paying into California trickle down into the entire economy. That's why a lot of us got $600 checks a few months ago from the government of California, specifically not the federal government, but because of Gavin Newsom's own surplus, and they were sending out checks. And the thing is if more rich people that are actually like funding a lot of these taxes, if they're leaving because they don't feel like it's a good place to live anymore, it does trickle down to everyone else.
If that's true, that would be a worry. I'm not as worried about a California exodus as you, but that's maybe a different topic for another day.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, I mean, certainly if that's true, that's theoretically would be concerning. But so, what are your thoughts on eminent domain? Let us know. Certainly an uncomfortable topic, especially if you've been the victim of it, as some people in Texas for the wall were. And yeah, let us know your thoughts on eminent domain and the rights the government has to seize public or private property. With that, I think we're going to shift over into kind of another topic related to the
Mm-hmm.
government's ability to seize individuals' property or sometimes individuals themselves, and connect it to some news we've heard. So, Alex, why don't you shift us over into what's going on in Canada and the talks around First Nations peoples and the reactions there?
Absolutely, man. And I think it's a really good segue, an unfortunate segue and a tragic segue, but very important. So basically, just to summarize, between 1830 and 1998, so literally 23 years ago, the Canadian government and churches basically took close to 200,000 Native children from the First Peoples, as they call them, and they took them from their parents and confined them to boarding schools that they weren't teaching kids to think for themselves and do their own thing or learn and live. They were teaching kids drop your indigenous heritage, learn English, subscribe to the indoctrination of the Catholic Church, and move forward. And we'll get into this later, but Canada actually over the last decade has a Truth and Reconciliation Commission that looked into some of these atrocities, and they said what happened over the last 150 years was a cultural genocide, and it is. And just the last thing I'll say is that over the last month, they have found a shit ton, excuse my language, of mass graves around Canada, in Vancouver to Calgary to the center parts of the country. And they found a lot of dead kids that have never been named, have never been given any hope, that all died in these damn schools. And there's talks of suicide. Kids were told you cannot speak your native language or you'll be beat. And there's a lot of just depression amongst these people, and some of it was suicide. Also, like diseases like smallpox, tuberculosis ravaged a lot of them, and these kids were just buried without any reconciliation or just dialogue with these families, Drew. And I think it's a broader conversation because the U.S. is definitely not different from this. But now we're seeing churches burning, and that was a great article you shared. But we're just seeing kind of a anger in Canada around this, and a rightful anger. But now the next question is, how do you reconcile with your past and also move forward?
Yeah, right. So this is a topic that has been talked about in the United States and Canada before, especially in academic circles. Hopefully, not enough in the lower education and public education, in my opinion. But in academic circles, this is a conversation that happens a lot. These boarding schools where Native Americans in America or Canada, or in Canada, they're sometimes called First Nations peoples, but Native Americans were forcibly removed from their families and put in these schools to basically reprogram them to become more European culture, basically be more white, sometimes physically bleaching skin, cutting hair, preventing them from speaking any native languages, forcing them to wear European style clothes, forcing them to convert to the religion, in Canada's case Catholicism, often in the US case Christianity of many types. But it was basically a re-education program for kids and so sometimes they were given up by parents, oftentimes they were taken from parents, not given updates, right? And so this is not new news to people. This is something that we've known has been going on. The reason it's flared up again is because a study was done in Canada to look at some of the deeper effects of these schools in Canada, and they uncovered what Alex was saying, these graves. So, I think it was somewhere up 731 unmarked graves in Saskatoon, 200 and something graves at one other site. Like, we're talking hundreds, if not thousands, of unmarked graves. And what that means is that does not necessarily mean, and this is where you have to be really careful about when you're reading the reporting and the language used, is what that means is that doesn't mean that they were just like executing kids. What it probably means is a lot of kids died of diseases, or suicide, depression, or like hunger strikes. But my guess is mostly diseases. And why that's not just a guess is I've actually looked at here is we have I think I had voices. There it is. Voices from boarding schools. Direct quotes from superintendents, teachers, students, and Supreme Courts, especially from the Secretary of the Interior. Now, this is more the U.S. boarding schools, but just looking at the type of activities that happen there, which are very similar to those in Canada, we can see that. I see one here. They said like in 1 year, they're like, we had 200 kids. No, there it is. Here it is. So we had 200 pupils last year, and only 6 died. Only 6. And that's a good year. They're like, the health of the scholars was generally good. Only 6 died. This school averaged a fraction over 200 people. Yeah, representing 29 tribes. So so 6 out of 100, right? That's 3-4% chance your kid's gonna die, just in any year, just in 1 year. I mean, imagine if you set your kid to a preschool where they had 200 kids, and you're like, don't worry, we did pretty good last year. Like only 6 kids died. But that's the idea. So just so we understand what we're talking about, we're not talking about Catholic priests like executing Indian kids. We're talking about them attempting at re-educating them into Catholic culture. Now, that's not good at all. I think that should be a good thing, and we'll get into a lot of reasons why. But just so we're clear on what these mass graves were, and they also think that they were at one point marked with probably wooden crosses that had deteriorated. So just to give that a little bit more context. But what I want to be clear though is it was not nice.
No.
From what we have is again 11 deaths among our 400 students this year. 4 from tuberculosis, 1 from tubercular epilepsy, 1 from dropsy, another from chronic malaria, and 1 from suicide. Right? That's in Pennsylvania, 1886. They talk about how there's one here that's pretty. Here it is: kill the Indian, save the man. Transfer the savage born infant into the surroundings of civilization, and he will grow to possess a civilized language and habit. All right, so it was very clear that this was to kill, literally to steal the young generation of Indians, to kill off any cultural ties they had to their ancestors, and to basically say, you now have to act white. And I don't know. That's so messed up. And it's amazing that I looked here in the New York Post. This person, Kelly Jane Torrance, who does correctly criticize media at not understanding what the mass graves were, because some media was reporting it as like a Nazi killing Jews in a mass grave, which is very different. But but she totally misses the mark. And I hear this all the time from the right wing, where she says it's a terrible thing that these children died. It's a terrible thing of what they that we need to reconcile with all this. But she did say, but most priests were well intentioned, and they were just trying to save them into Christianity. And I think that really. And I'm trying to find the exact quote here. Anyone wants to really quote this can. It's New York Post, Kelly Jane Torrance. But there's one part in here. Yeah, most of the teachers, nuns, and priests in charge were well-meaning, though, as in any group, some bad apples took advantage of their positions to inflict abuse. The idea was to turn poverty-stricken children into productive, even prosperous members of mainstream Canadian society, and from the church's perspective, to save their souls. So, like, you can tell the way she's talking, she kind of still has that idea in her head. Like, well, the idea was a good one. And I say no, the original idea was not a good one. It was to literally kill a culture that they deemed undesirable and lesser than themselves.
Yes. Okay. So first things first. What blows my mind about this is that what the Catholic Church, and I honestly, like, I'm not even putting blame specifically on the Catholic Church at this point, even though there's definitely blame to be put there. It's more that I'm surprised that even up to 1998, we are seeing similar conversion tactics, that the conquistadors used in the 1490s. Like to me, just like that's my first takeaway here is that not a lot has changed in how a lot of European Western culture is dealing with the indigenous. It's basically like if we just force them to read English, speak English, and learn about our history, their culture will go out the door. I think any sociologist, any historian, any person with a brain could understand that you can't just take the fight out of a dog because you tell the dog it can't fight anymore. And I understand that was probably not the best one to say, like fight a dog, blah blah blah. But you get what I mean, right? Is that like it's really hard to take like the culture out of somebody just by forcing them to do something they don't want to do. And I'm just surprised that the Catholic Church has never understood that this tactic doesn't work. A country, especially a Western democracy, functions on differences. And it just alarms me. Like, I listened to the New York Times Daily where they had a guy, Ken Thomas, who was an indigenous man who went to one of these schools. He was just taken in a van at age 6, and he was taken to the Musqueam Indian Residential School. I really apologize for the pronunciation, but he basically talks about how the nuns immediately shaved his braids, told him he would be punished if he spoke in his native language, and he mentions that in the first week a classmate committed suicide after trying to escape. They were locked in a classroom, and he also talked about contractors when he was there were just digging up bones left and right. And like the sad thing is it's like damned if I do, damned if I don't. Like the people who stood up for their indigenous culture were beaten, locked up, basically treated like prisoners, and I could imagine that would lead to a lot of suicidal tendencies. And the people that went along also might have got tuberculosis because, let's be honest, like the book 1491, people should read. It talks about how like a lot of the Americas just had never been exposed to these diseases. They also just had a different genetic makeup over like, millennia of being separated from the European evolution of people. Like people are different, around the world you're exposed to different diseases. And so if you put a bunch of kids in a school together, and there's going to be some serious diseases going out of there, and I just wish someone had the foresight to deal with that. And it really breaks my heart because this Truth and Reconciliation Commission out of Canada, they estimated that about 4,100 children vanished from these schools, and but those numbers do seem to be higher. Now, Drew, on that New York Post thing, which I just wanted to touch on really quick, is that article is flawed in so many ways. There's like a few paragraphs I agree with, but it to me seems like this is a weird parallel I'm going to bring up here. Is that it seems like a lot like the George Floyd killing, and just hear me out here. Is that like a lot of like the New York Post and a lot of the Republicans who would probably read the New York Post were like, yes, it was horrible. George Floyd shouldn't have died, but is always the key term in some of these. Is that but like what were they doing? Like what was the background behind this? Like it was only like a few bad apples who did this, but the system isn't rotten. And to me it seems like the same thing happened here. Is that okay, yes, there are people burning churches in Canada, and like I think that's something interesting to talk about. Like I don't agree with that. Like I don't think burning Catholic churches throughout Canada is going to solve the problem. It's kind
No.
of the eye for the eye thing, you know.
Yes.
And I do agree with the point is that some of the protests over last summer were not looked at as the same as the anti-mask protests in Michigan. You know, like stuff like that. Like I think like sometimes the media focuses on these justice issues, and maybe rightfully so. But like for the New York Times or the New York Post, excuse me, just to be like, yeah, there were some bad apples. That's not the narrative I'm seeing. And I think that article shows like a lot of kind of the reason why we should teach critical race theory in some ways in schools. And I know that's weird for me to say right here is like we need to teach people about our history. And I think we're seeing some of the fallout of not teaching people about an accurate history right here because now we have different narratives. Like there were some good, there were some bad, like we had to do this, blah, blah, blah. It's like if we could just focus on teaching an unbiased history of our nation, maybe these things wouldn't be like spurring up every time.
Right. Well, it is worth mentioning that the arson, as we know, like we don't know all the suspects for these arsons, the Catholic Church. It doesn't
Right.
necessarily mean they are automatically native peoples, right? There have been countless native leaders that have denounced the church burnings, but of course still want to hold the government accountable and are talking about ways for social justice and things. It does mention here in this New York Post article that almost 2/3 of Canada's natives are Christian, 57% of those are Catholic, right? This is now. I mean, why do you think that is? I don't know. Maybe because the government engaged in a massive cultural reprogramming thing. Just like I don't know, but no. So, but yes. So I agree with you that burning down Catholic churches is not going to solve any issues. But it's also unwise to ignore why people are angry at this. Maybe there is some wounds that are left unhealed, and I would say that there are. I think that Indian country, which is kind of the term for like native people's rights in the Americas and as a whole. It could be from Central America to Canada. There's just people call it Indian country. Even some, it's kind of like in like saying like the black community. It'll be like, well, a lot of rumblings around this topic have gone through Indian country, and I think for Indian country as a whole, um, you know, there's a ton of topics that I think are stones that need to be turned over again. There's a lot of feeling of there hasn't been enough answers on some of these questions or not nearly enough representation of our problems in government, whether it's Canada or the US or other places I've been, like Costa Rica has problems with, and issues with native representation in there. So this topic bubbled up again in Canada, but I guarantee you it will bubble up again in the United States and anywhere in the world where there has been an indigenous group that's been forcibly removed from what they used to know. Um, but super fascinating stuff, and again, not that it's exactly the same as eminent domain, but just that idea of like, we have to set boundaries on how much power a government does have over individuals, and this is a good example of where the government had way too much power to take children from their parents, have them die of tuberculosis, not tell the parents that happened. I mean, just insane stuff.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's truly heartbreaking, and it's sadly something we see, which to me just is like the inherent nature of man. Sadly, is like you want people to look, talk, and believe what you believe, and like to me, I love I love America. I love the United States. I really do. You know, I like the idea in a nutshell. And like I'm kind of turning this more into the United States than Canada for a second. But to me, it like I understand why in some ways there's always a backlash against learning about these tough events because it seems like our country always wants to recognize past it like doesn't want to like reconcile with past issues because I'm thinking out loud here, but it's like there's a percentage of Americans that feel by reconciling with our past, it's threatening their current image and narrative of their life. You know, like to now add some asterisks to the American dream, for example. I think it almost threatens some of those people's American dream. And I'm not defending that, but I think that's why there's an opposition by people, even this New York Times post, to try to like vindicate some of these nuns and priests by saying like there were some bad apples, but there were some good ones as well. And it's because like we have been fed a narrative for so long that like you know manifest destiny was a growth of our nation and it was like the American it was the fundamentals of American progress to keep growing. And you don't look at how we did that. You don't look at how we did that. And so it's like, I feel like there's this like game of chicken in a way going on between people who really love this, the patriotic side who are just like, I want to believe that what I'm doing is good. And then plus the actual history of how we got there. And I don't think we can ever reconcile with our past until we find a way to not only appease the people who are proud of their country, usually Eurocentric white Americans, and also how do we also talk about the indigenous problem and what happened to those people along the way in the same sentence without dividing and causing a culture war.
Well, I think just for the people that, I mean, I think it's just in general, I think people that are scared to learn about the past or not like, I don't know,
No, it's tough.
learning
It's really tough.
learning about America's tough past makes me want to make the country better. It makes me want to be
Right.
more patriotic. I think for others, they're scared to, like you said, put an asterisk on the American dream. But that's an immature way to look at life. That's a
Absolutely.
that's a narrow-minded view on life in general. So I don't think we should appease those people. I think they should open their eyes.
No, and I totally agree. I just feel like we need to find some like line basically between like maybe not burn churches because I
Well,
would
I'm
just
not.
imagine
I'm not. Very
no,
little people
I
are
know you're not.
advocating for burning churches. Yeah.
No, I know what you mean, but I just feel like you have to find a line between the people who don't want to talk about the past because it has an asterisk to their like personal family legacy and also dealing with the past. And like an eye for an eye either way is like I just like it kind of I mean we could have a whole other podcast on just the idea of reparations. But I think
Sure.
it goes into that is like how do you balance past and future with while keeping the present moment healthy? And I don't think like Canada and the United States specifically are doing well. Now the one thing I will say is that at least Canada has a reconciliation commission.
Hmm.
It's always surprised me that the US is never willing to do that, man. It really pisses me off.
Yeah, they're not even. Yeah, and you're right. So we'll have to see. I mean, so Trudeau has as Trudeau has officially condemned the arson, and you're right that they have that commission. So we'll have to see what happens. This is not, but just for those that are maybe are a little just like didn't know what this issue was. Hopefully, you now have a little bit more insight. And certainly, this issue is something that we see anywhere that there was the remnants of colonialism. These things bubble up, and that's why historyism matters. That's why things in the past do affect us today, and we need to look at that. But we need to look at it with some nuance, and this is certainly an issue with a lot of nuance because yeah, I don't want churches to be burned either, but they're being burned for a reason, and the reason is pretty grotesque. So I guess we'll end that topic with that, and we'll go into some more current events. Alex, what is going on regarding protests and violence in some parts of the world as we wrap up here?
Interesting stuff, man. Cuba is the first one that comes to my mind because basically, like, COVID, the totalitarian regime, if you want to call it that, and just a failing economy and just suppression of free speech has kind of culminated in Cuba. Also, the sanctions that the Trump administration reinstated have just caused one of the biggest mobilizations of anti Castroism, if that's a word, against the Cuban government. And in the same like sphere, we are seeing current protests and actually more like mob violence in South Africa, because Jacob Zuma, who was the president of South Africa in the 90s into the 2000s, he's a very corrupt dude, and he's like pulling a lot of straws out of the authoritarian playbook, because he is right now being heard for potentially going to prison for a long time for corruption like charges in the 90s, and he has basically said it's all fake, and he's mobilized his base, which is an ethnic group in South Africa, and he's turned it into kind of an ethnic mob revolt against. Let me pull up his name really quick because I always really struggle with it. Ramaphosa is the current president of South Africa. He was seen as he's kind of like the Biden of South Africa, if you really want to talk about it like that. Like Jacob Zuma was kind of a Trump-like figure, corrupt, kind of a big personality. And Ramaphosa, once Zuma got arrested and charged, Ramaphosa was kind of seen as the alternative. And now we're seeing Zuma rally his ethnic base to go, and they're looting restaurants, shops. The economy is tanking. Foreign investors are leaving. And The Economist says, in quotes, this is the worst violence since apartheid rule. And the Cubans, in the same way, I mean, I think the deal in Cuba was basically like, the Cubans always assumed, like, okay, if we give away some of our liberties, at least we'll get security, right? Like, okay, like our healthcare system's actually pretty robust. We have a vaccine. COVID's been okay. The economy's always but we'll go with this regime. But lately, the vaccine is not working well. They don't have that many doses. The economy is tanking, and the government is no longer providing security. And so we're seeing mobilization of people, go against the Cuban government. And to me, the biggest question in both of these, to draw a parallel, is in South Africa and Cuba, will the government give a carrot or will they use a stick? And what I mean, will the governments give people some sort of incentive to quiet down and go home, or will they use the stick and beat protesters?
Well, it looks like Cuba's using the stick because
Yeah.
they've shut down the internet. They have detained protesters, um, and yeah, they're not responding in a way that I think is good. I think that Cuba, yeah, I mean, I think Cuba had, like its own economic issues, and then on top of that, the closure of of normalcy following Barack Obama. Like Barack Obama was trying to slowly open things back up to Cuba. There was like one American-owned Cuban hotel. Some cruises were allowed to go back to Havana, but then Donald Trump stopped all that. That obviously has an economic impact on Cuba. Not like the biggest, right? Because they've been pretty blocked off from the American economy for a while. But in general, yeah, they had a rough time. But then with COVID, I think COVID, as we've seen in a lot of shaky nation states around the world, is that COVID is changing a lot of things, right? It's bringing a lot of nations to their heel. Brazil, almost the United States at one point. India. Um, Cuba's no exception, and yeah, the reaction from the Cuban government is definitely, to me, like confirms my suspicions, which is that Cuba, I think, is touted as the one of the like successful socialist regimes. Is like, it's not like North Korea. You're not like, if you don't have a boot on your neck. Cuba's been able to, despite all this American imperialist aggression, been able to survive as a successful socialist state. I've never fully bought that argument, and now this confirms it to me that it's true, when my suspicions were true, that it's a failed state, and that it's no different than any others in how quick they are to quell individual rights, to shut off the internet when people start protesting, which is something that Libya did, such as something that Egypt did, just something that the Philippines does. Anytime there's any kind of revolution starting, they shut off the entire internet, they ban people from posting about it on social media, and they start detaining protesters. So Cuba is no different than any other overbearing police state. And it just confirms my suspicions, right? I do see, like, very very rarely, but I do see people on the left that are like more left than me, that defend Cuba as like a beacon of socialist hope. This to me confirms that it's not. And I hope that the people there continue to fight for what they, because it started right. It starts with I think I think it was the power outages. I think there's power outages in some towns that started some protesting, and then the protesters grew from that, from just generic distrust and disheartenance with the government. And now with the internet being shut down, it's like a full on "this government sucks" kind of thing. And so protesters are chanting, with what do we have to lose kind of thing. Let's see. I'm trying to get some quotes here. Repression is all we have, was one protester told CNN. But so I don't know. It's just I think it's cool to see Cuba finally rising up. I hope this really makes change. And then what you posted just the other day, which is cool, that Biden is trying to help the people of Cuba out by allowing remittances again, which is where people can send money back that they've earned in the United States back to their families. This is a big part of a lot of immigration to the United States. I think it should be allowed to happen. And yeah, they're just worried about the government taking that remittance money. What do you think about that?
Well, yeah, I mean, I feel like remittances are kind of the crucial part here. Like, that was the issue with Trump, is that I think Obama was trying to do something that was a good idea. It was just like trying to open up the economy and tell businesses, mainly foreign businesses, that Cuba is not that toxic. Because Cuba's not that toxic. Like, let's be honest, like Raul Castro compared to Fidel, I mean, he truly did open up the economy and open up the country in some ways. Now, I'm not defending him because I think it's an atrocious authoritarian state to this day. But it is not or it is not North Korea, like you said. It's not even a China in a lot of ways. And remittances were a way that let's be honest, like I think it was following those big protests in the late 80s, early 90s, where basically the Cuban government, where Fidel Castro was still running it, he basically said, like, if you don't like this economy, go back to Cuba. I mean, go back to Florida. Like, go find your relatives in Florida. And a lot of Cubans went to Florida. Let's be honest, a lot of people don't like being told they can't speak or eat or watch, like, foreign news, so they left. And the thing is that remittances are important because, like, just to put a definition on it, they're the private savings of workers and families that are spent in the home country for food, clothing, and other expenditures, like basically life expenditures. So you have people in Cuba getting money from Cubans in Florida who are definitely making more money than Cubans in Havana, and they're sending it back to, like, just help for the basic essentials. And, like, remittances in a lot of ways drive Cuba's economy. And it's good that, because, like, I feel like Trump scared everyone away from Cuba. He basically made it illegal to do, like, foreign transactions or, like, discussions even with companies inside of Cuba. And Biden is trying to, like, find a way to fix that, because obviously, like, Cuba is not great, and we shouldn't just kowtow to what they're doing right now. And Biden's trying to find a kind of a middle ground, and I think remittances are the way. Like, these are not just, dark money that are going into Cuba to fund the communist regime. These are going to actual people on the ground who want help. And like Drew on earlier, I just feel like what happened in Cuba though during COVID was that there's always been a compromise in Cuba between the Cuban people and their government. And it's kind of this autocratic compromise in a lot of ways. It's like the regime is going to provide the people with health care, basic essentials, a roof over their head, and food. And they're going to give up some liberties and freedoms in exchange for that. But now the government can't do that.
Yeah.
The government transferred their currency. I did a catching up back in October where the CUC, which is a convertible currency, which is pegged to the American dollar, is used for foreign investments. But the actual Cuban people use the Cuban peso. So there's like a dichotomy of what foreign people in Cuba use and what Cubans use. And the government, it was a really dumb idea to actually like create that distinction. And now there's just electricity shortages, empty grocery shops, a failing economy, a repressive government, and even COVID, which was their kind of shining light on the hill. They can't even deal with that now. So it's like, I just am always surprised when I see like the right say, let's do another Bay of Pigs. Let's go in there and stop this regime. And I see the left say, no, Cuba's doing it right. Like, not all the left, but like the more like progressive, like AOC leaning people who are like, no, Cuba has free healthcare. Yes. Yeah. And I just feel like Cuba's become this idealized thing in the U.S. In reality, like, it needs free and fair elections. But the problem is what Trump did is he pushed them closer to Venezuela. And I remember in in college you did a thing on ALBA, which is that deal, between several of those countries. But I feel
Yes.
like Cuba's reliant on Venezuela, and that's probably not great. Just saying.
Yeah, Cuba gave Venezuela medical supplies in return for oil, but the oil market crashed for a bit. Now it's back, but that's the problem is you don't want to base your entire economy or at least your healthcare trade economy on just one thing, oil. But yeah, and then with South, I think I do have to get going soon. But with South
Yes.
Africa, I mean, I have seen an increase in. I mean, did you see that viral video of the guy in the truck who was driving the truck and like got shot at the armored truck and everything, and he like kept his cool and did some like crazy James Bond shit.
Yeah, I did see that, man, and freaking South Africa is insane, man. Like I
Yeah.
actually just see South Africa is misinformation and partisan politics again. This seems to me more like kind of a Trumpy type of thing where like, Jacob Zuma's potentially going to prison. He keeps pushing it off. He tells his supporters to go to the streets. And it's like to me the mix of politics and misinformation is what's happening in South Africa because you have people that are just destroying just destroying businesses, and there's just a mob violence mentality that is very bad for especially a country like South Africa that has what I read yesterday in The Economist, the highest unemployment rate in the world. Um,
Woo.
and it's to me it's like the difference between Cuba and South Africa is that in South Africa it's all lies. In Cuba the people are just like sick of the status quo.
Mm. Mm.
So I don't know.
Well, we might have to do a deeper dive into South Africa because that seems
Yes,
like a powder keg ready to blow. But with that will be the Tonic Accord podcast, guys. Thank you all for listening, and stay tuned. And yeah, let us know what your thoughts on and whether it's anything we've talked about today, eminent domain, the issues with Native First Nations in Canada and boarding schools, or these current protests and violence going on in Cuba and South Africa. Let us know your thoughts and take care.
thank you.